Okay, are you ready to hear from Tulsi?
Can you thank Mark and Becky again?
Mark's there.
Mark's owner, Becky's the manager.
Okay, thank you. How about a hand for our very own Yvette? She's a powerful woman in a small package. Don't underestimate Yvette. She's made grown men cry. Thank you all so much for coming here today. And Mark, right? Thank you so much for hosting us. This is Mark's place. Jackson's is Mark's place. We called him, less than 48 hours ago, saying, hey, can you help us out? Thank you so much. Really, really awesome to be here in such a great space, and thank you for bringing your little girl to come and join us. And who is Becky? Becky's the manager here, who's been very, very helpful to us, as well as Becky outside right now. She's probably working inside. All right, these things, you know, they take some work to put together, and I'm just so glad that on short notice, all of you took the time to come out to give me the chance to share my aloha with all of you. I didn't know that I was going to be able to come to this event here in Milwaukee until a few days ago, so this is why all the pieces coming together in the last minute. But it's been a beautiful, beautiful day that we've had here, that we started out this morning actually at the LULAC conference happening down the street with a group of veterans. And there was no better way to start the day than at a breakfast gathering called the Defenders of Freedom, where I had the opportunity to thank and honor service members and veterans from across generations. And it's always, you know, this is my family, so it's always special to me to be able to get to hang out with them, but really it's a continuous reminder, as I talked about with them this morning, about the values and principles that are at the heart of someone who raises their hand and volunteers to lay their life down for this country. These principles of service above self, and how that example that we see in our service members and our veterans is really the example that should inspire the leaders of our country. I think some of you have heard me talk about this before, about how instead of leaders who are truly of, by, and for the people, leaders who are truly inspired by this ideal of service above self, we instead have a government of, by, and for the rich and powerful, of, by, and for greedy corporations, of, by, and for self-serving politicians, all of whom are looking out for their own selfish interests, how they can pass laws, how they can influence policies, how they can make their mark in our government to serve whatever it is their own selfish goal is, whether it's more money for a lobbyist corporation that they work for, or if it's a politician who's looking for more power or a good paying, cushy job after they leave office. You look down the line and you can see the consequence of this in the impact that it has on each of our everyday lives. You know, the things that we worry about, the things that keep us up at night, the thing that we're concerned about with our loved ones, our children, our family, our friends, things that we're concerned about with our own future. Why is it that we have these perennial problems that never seem to get solved? We have to get to the heart of the problem, and the heart is that we don't have a government that is truly and solely focused on this mission of service to the people. Healthcare is an issue that's on the top of most people's minds. You know, most families are just one healthcare emergency away from total disaster. And you're concerned about these things that can come out, these emergencies, or an illness, or a pre-existing condition. You're concerned about what kind of healthcare coverage you have, or skyrocketing prescription drug prices. So we look at why are so many so concerned about this? In a country like the United States of America, this should not be the number one concern on people's minds. But then you look at legislation, even like the Affordable Care Act, that increased insurance coverage for a lot of folks, but still a lot of that coverage didn't provide that security blanket that they needed because of high deductibles. That when that emergency happened, they couldn't afford to pay that high deductible of $2,000 or $2,500. That we still have people who are small business owners, who are self-employed, even under the Affordable Care Act, who are paying $1,000 a month for their health care insurance. Or you have the reality that in the original draft of the Affordable Care Act, I'm told there was the provision written in there that would have allowed Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices. It wasn't there in the final draft that passed. Why? Is it because those lawmakers who were writing and working on that bill decided that that was something that would help us? That Medicare should not be allowed to negotiate these drug prices down because it's good for the people? No, absolutely not. Who was that good for? Big Pharma. That benefited Big Pharma, and it's because their lobbyists have such great influence in Washington. They saw that provision in the bill. They said, nope. We can't allow that to stay in there. We can't allow that to pass. This is just one very present and relevant example of so many as we look at that influence, whether it's of big insurance, big pharma, big Wall Street banks, private prisons, military-industrial complex. You can go down the list and see how you connect those dots. This is how we get to the heart of the problem, and this is how we bring about the kind of change that we are all seeking to bring. You wouldn't be here tonight if you were not wanting to be an active part of this change. You wouldn't be here tonight. You wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't already know in your heart of hearts that it is only when we, the people, rise up and make sure that our voices are heard can we bring about the kind of systemic change that we need to see. Yes, there are a ton of policies that the Trump administration has pushed forward, a lot of changes they've made that I find to be very harmful to the people of this country. Policies that I oppose, but I also know that there were people suffering in this country before November of 2016. And if we're serious about making change, if we're serious about winning this election so we can make change, we have to address those deeper seated problems. Those folks who felt left behind, who felt unheard, who felt ignored by a government not of by and for the people, but a government of by and for the very few, the very richest and the most powerful. So living out and bringing about this vision that our founders had for us, a government of, by, and for the people, are not words that we should take lightly. This is the mission that we all have, and the only way we bring this about is when we hold leaders accountable and we use the power of our voices in the many ways that we can. Yes, at a very basic level in how we cast our vote, but it's using our voices to bring about that kind of change, to hold accountability every single day. Raising awareness around different issues, helping get others involved and engaged in the process, bringing people together, bringing people into the fold who maybe gave up a long time ago on our whole political system. I am heartened, I'm a little sad, but I'm also heartened every day as I look, and every day I see comments on my social media channels, or we get emails from people saying, you know, I haven't voted in 20 years, or I've never participated in a campaign. Your campaign is the very first one I've ever contributed to in my life. I'm grateful to have that trust and that confidence and that support, but it's a sign of how far we have to go. How far we have to go to strengthen our democracy and make sure that our voices are heard, to make sure that we can pass big change, like making sure we have health care for all. Hi, Rebecca. Nice to see you. To make sure that every sick American in this country is able to get the care that they need, regardless of how much or how little you have in your pocket. To bring about the kind of bold investments that we need to make sure that we all have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. What a novel concept. Clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, the two most basic things that every one of us needs to live, to survive. What to speak of to thrive, to make sure that we have a safe and beautiful home, planet that we can enjoy and live in today, but that will still be there thriving and sustaining our kids and their kids and generations to come. when we raise our voices saying this is the kind of future that we want, we can bring about the systemic change we need to see in our criminal justice system. We're seeing in the news now how a very, very wealthy pedophile was able to make a backroom deal to get off with a very light sentence, as we have so many nonviolent, quote-unquote, drug offenders who are rotting away in our prisons. We see how our criminal justice system is benefiting the rich and punishing the poor. This is why I've introduced legislation like the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act, to begin to end this failed war on drugs. How we deal with the opioid crisis that's ravaging so much of our country. How we're punishing people who really need help, who are struggling with addiction, by throwing them in jail rather than saying, hey, let's take those precious resources, our taxpayer dollars, and instead of continuing to support a prison system with high recidivism rates, let's try to lower those recidivism rates by getting you the help that you need through treatment and recovery and empowerment and housing and jobs and education. We're serious about helping people. Let's actually help people. These are just a few of the many things that we as a country need to tackle when we're really focused on serving the people, on putting those values of service above self at the forefront of all that we do. Now, all of these things require investment. They require a focused investment and use of our taxpayer dollars and our resources, of which there are limits. There are limits. We cannot begin to make these investments unless we deal with one central issue, which is the cost of war. Now, this cost of war is something that in the room that I was in this morning at that breakfast with many different veterans, many who served in Vietnam and the Gulf War, and my generation of post 9/11 veterans, cost of war means something very personal to us. Those of us who've lost friends, who've paid the ultimate price. Those who have seen our fellow service members come home with both visible and invisible wounds. We've seen this terribly high human cost of war. But there's a price that every single one of us has paid, whether you've worn the uniform or not. Every time you've been told that there's not enough money to pay our teachers to provide our kids a good education. Every time you've been told, well, there's not enough money to make sure that folks in Flint, Michigan have clean water to drink and to bathe in. Every time we've been told that there's not enough money to invest in our infrastructure so we have safe roads and bridges. Every time we've been told there's not enough money to help people who are addicted to opioids because of big pharma's criminal actions in proliferating these drugs on our streets. Every time we are told no by these politicians, the very same ones who don't think twice before casting that vote or advocating for yet another wasteful regime change war, every one of us, every one of our families, every one of our communities is paying the price for war. This must end. Every single one of us is paying the price for war. Since 9/11 alone, all of us have paid over $6 trillion on these wasteful regime change wars. Over $6 trillion. Try to think about what $6 trillion looks like. What do you do with $6 trillion other than reduce the deficit? What do you do with $6 trillion? Well, something that makes this a little bit more tangible, Afghanistan. Right now we're spending about $4 billion a month in Afghanistan. $4 billion a month in Afghanistan. Now, I was with a group of mayors a little over a week ago were gathering for their annual conference, and I was talking to them about these numbers because I served on the city council in Honolulu, and mayors and council members, people in the municipal level of government, that's where the rubber meets the road. And you count every single dollar that you have to figure out how do you make sure the trash gets picked up on time, that our firefighters have what they need, that our police officers have the tools they need, to make sure that you've got those potholes filled. These are very real, tangible things that if you don't address, trust me, you hear about it. So I was talking to them about this, $4 billion a month in Afghanistan. And what they talked about is a federal grant called a Community Development Block Grant. It's the #1 federal grant that is looked forward to by the municipal government. The amount of that grant that is split up nationally by every single community, town, city, county is $3 billion. $3 billion every year to cover the needs of the cities and counties across our country. $4 billion a month to Afghanistan. For what? Exactly. That is the question. That is the point. That our hard-earned taxpayer dollars are continuing. This is not a thing of the past. They're continuing to pay for these wasteful regime change wars and the nation building and the aftermath that comes, while families, schools, hospitals, people, communities here continue to struggle, continue to suffer. So when reporters ask me sometimes, Tulsi, why do you always talk about foreign policy? It's just one of many other issues. Why don't you talk about all these other issues that we really care about in our homes and in our workplaces, in our communities? Because unless we deal with the cost of war, everything else is an empty promise. That's the reality and that's the truth. That's why I'm so committed. That's why I'm focused so clearly on ending these wasteful regime change wars, working to end this new Cold War and nuclear arms race that is making us less safe and is taking more money out of our pockets to build more of these nuclear weapons that are smaller and more dangerous and more easily used. Bringing about this kind of change in our leadership and in our foreign policy will redirect our resources, making it so that we can invest them where they're needed most, right here in serving the needs of our people. Now, this won't come easily. There are a lot of people who've been benefiting and profiting for a long time based on continuing this status quo. This is where we come in. This is where every one of us comes in. Because we know that throughout history, anytime big change has happened, it's only happened when we, the people, have risen up and said, we demand action. We demand change. No more of these wasteful wars. We are going to put our people and our country first. And the other thing that this requires is someone who's ready to do the job of Commander-in-Chief on day one. And my service in the Army National Guard over 16 years and deploying twice the Middle East, and the time that I've had in Congress over 6 years on the Foreign Affairs, the Armed Services and Homeland Securities Committees, focused on the importance of our national security and keeping the American people safe, but also knowing the cost of war. I'm ready to walk in on day one and do that job of Commander-in-Chief, knowing, and each of you having the confidence and the trust that I'm not going to bend to the wishes of the foreign policy establishment, that I won't be influenced by the military-industrial complex and the money that they dangle before me, that I won't be intimidated by a uniform, no matter how many stars he or she has on their shoulder, because I know exactly what my mission is. My mission of serving the people of this country, of putting our interests first, of working with everyone here to build a strong future with peace and prosperity for everyone. This does not mean that we have an isolationist policy where we turn our back on the world and we hunker down and only look inward. No, this is the exact opposite. That our country, the United States of America, can actually be the great leader and the force for good in the world that we should be. Building a foreign policy that's based on cooperation rather than conflict. Being able to work out our differences with leaders in other countries without only resorting to dropping bombs or crippling economic sanctions. So I'm here today asking for your support, because it will require every single one of us and then a whole bunch of other people standing together and speaking with one voice to bend this arc of history away from war and towards peace, so that we can truly usher in a new century of opportunity, of justice, of equality, a bright future for every single American. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for joining me in this movement. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd love to answer a few questions while we're all here. First, I want to apologize. I didn't catch your name, sir, but I feel so badly for knocking over your drink. I owe you one. I'm sorry. Thank you.
He was going to donate.
I know, right? Yes.
Okay, so I just graduated from with a teaching degree, and I know it's really hard for a lot of the public teachers to get that support and that funding for school, just because resources and whatnot. So what is your plan with education to further it with public education?
Well, thank you, first of all, for choosing to be a teacher. That's an incredible service to our society, and it's not an easy job.
Not easy at all, but I love it.
That you have to love it. You have to love it, and it's our responsibility in government and as a community to just make sure you've got the tools that you need to do the job that you love, to teach and take care of our kids. When we talk about our mixed up priorities, this is exactly what I'm talking about. My father-in-law is a public high school teacher in Hawaii. And so we hear directly from him about how much he's spending out of his pocket to buy supplies for his students. That when he is finished with teaching for the day and says bye to the kids, his day is nowhere near from being done. The stacks of papers he takes home to grade and to read, and the work that he puts into doing a job that he loves. We hear about a lot of the reforms that have taken place through different administrations that come from the highest levels of government, telling teachers like you, here's how you must teach. I think one of the biggest problems and the kinds of change we need to see in that, in addition to making sure you have the resources that you need, is to first listen to our teachers about how best we can support them in doing their job. Thank you. Yes. Support the Second Amendment like I do the rest. Can I finish? All right, thank you. As we stand up for our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, as we stand up for the First Amendment, we stand up and support and protect the Second Amendment as well. I think it's important that with that, just like with the rest of the rights that we have, they are not completely unfettered. We have to think about the safety of society. So I think there are sensible gun safety laws that we should have in place that I think the vast majority of the American people support. Universal background checks is a no-brainer that should occur, ultimately helping us to meet that objective of making sure that those who would seek to do harm to others with a gun shouldn't be allowed to own it, ultimately. Thank you. Yes. I believe in free speech. I believe in free speech. And this is an important thing, whether you're talking about NFL players taking a knee, or you're talking about people posting videos or content online. whether you agree or disagree with the exercising or the expression of that free speech. It's people like me who've put our life on the line so that those freedoms exist. This is why I'm extremely concerned about what we're seeing more and more online with Facebook or Google or YouTube and others that are censoring those who have speech that they disagree with. That kind of power held in the hands of very few is a very dangerous thing. Yep.
The last 5 years, so bad that I forego a supplemental and pay cash at Costco for my drug price.
Wow.
They make it so expensive.
Wow.
And it changes every year. But
Yeah.
I'm not clear where you stand on private insurance
Yeah.
with Medicare for all.
Thank you. Good question. The question is about what is the role of private insurance as we see more and more private insurance profiting with the supplemental Medicare plans because the Medicare coverage that you have really isn't good enough. I support a Medicare for All plan that makes sure that every single person has that basic quality care that every single one of us needs when we need it. I think that there should be a role for some private insurance to play for those who choose it. That has to be determined, and that's something that I'm looking carefully into. This is a huge change in our policy, and I'm looking to all the other major countries in the world that have universal health care, that have that mandated quality care for everybody, and they have a role for private insurance for those who choose to buy into it. So I think it's flipping the notion when people talk about having a public option. I think that's the wrong premise of this. I think it's more about having universal care provided through Medicare for All and having a private option for those who choose to buy into it. Yes.
This is an easy question. The Senate just passed a $750 billion defense budget for 2020. Now it's in the House. How do you plan to vote?
The Senate bill has not yet come over to the House. The House is going through its own defense bill. That vote will be taking place tomorrow, and I'm still going through the bill before I determine how I'm going to vote on it. There are 80 or a number of amendments that passed today, and so I'm going through and seeing what are the changes that have been made to the bill before I make a decision.
$750 billion.
Well, it's lower actually. The House bill has a lower amount of funding than what the Senate bill passed, but like I said earlier, overall, the amount that we're spending on these defense bills, the amount we're spending on these wars, on making and building all these new nuclear weapons, is way too much. There's no question about that. It's a question about how we're changing our policy so that we can bring down the cost of that spending. Yes.
You have a bill that would prohibit the U.S. government from supporting current and future enemies.
Yeah.
What are the obstacles to getting that passed? Who are the obstacles, and predict the future on that?
Who do we replace? Your question is about my bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. This was a bill that I introduced as a result of the knowledge that there have been now for quite some time, several years, both direct and indirect support of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda with our taxpayer dollars. Why? Because in places like Syria, Al-Qaeda has been the strongest force on the ground fighting this regime change war that the United States has been waging since 2011. And this support has been happening both directly as well as indirectly being funneled through countries like Saudi Arabia. This is something that's still ongoing now in Yemen. Now, something historic happened in Congress. Both the House and Senate passed legislation to stop the United States' support of Saudi Arabia's genocidal war in Yemen, to stop providing that military support. Now, as it sounds like many of you know, that bill went to the president. The president vetoed it, but there was not enough votes to override that veto. So that support continues today. Under my bill, that support would not be allowed to continue. because it's already being widely reported how Saudi Arabia is directly supporting Al-Qaeda and directly supporting other terrorist groups.
How many co-sponsors did you get?
Very few co-sponsors, very few. So it's
Revealing.
it is revealing. It is revealing about either how few leaders in Washington are aware of what's actually happening, or how many of them refuse to do the right thing and take action, to pass into law something that is illegal for any one of us to do. If you were to go and write a check to Al-Qaeda saying, hey, here, I support your cause, you would be thrown in jail. Yet our government is doing that very same thing with our taxpayer dollars. Okay. Yes.
Children are being denied of the human rights at the south border right now at the camps. What are your plans for eliminating these camps, for abolishing ICE, and for immigration reform?
Thank you. I've actually been down and tried to go and visit one of these camps in Miami a few weeks ago. And it is heartbreaking to see how these kids are continuing to be torn apart and away from their parents and their families.
But most of them are being rented and kidnapped to get people to the border though. Many of them are not with their parents.
Certainly not after they're taken from them by our government.
Well,
Look, here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line is we have kids who are being held in atrocious conditions on American soil.
That's right.
And that's what needs to end. And it needs to end now. Now this speaks to deeper seated problems within our broken immigration system. You mentioned abolishing ICE. Abolishing ICE is not going to solve the problem. Now ICE is deeply problematic, and these mass deportation mission that they're about to execute, it sounds like this weekend, is something that speaks to the problem of the leadership of ICE. If you abolish ICE, then basically you're taking a broken immigration system with laws that need to be reformed, and then placing that enforcement authority on some other federal or state or local law enforcement agency. So that alone is not going to solve the problem. Really what needs to happen is A, getting the resources to the border that are needed to make it so that those who are seeking asylum in this country are able to get their cases adjudicated very quickly. That we make sure that these kids are not being taken from their families, these families are not being separated, that we get rid of these highly overcrowded. You've got, what, over 150 people in a fenced cell meant for 50 people? I mean, these conditions are atrocious and they cannot be allowed to continue, especially when we learn that for these kids, it's costing us as taxpayers something like $750 per child per day. Per child per day. I mean, it costs a fraction of that to put them up in a Holiday Inn. So these point to deeper seated problems that we've got to fix, both within what's happening at the border immediately, as well as the broken legal immigration system that we have. So as we look at a lot of the different immigration policies and bills that have been put forward, whether we're dealing with something as specific as passing the DREAM Act, what is standing in the way every single time? Ultimately, it's partisan politics. Because with the DREAM Act, we've had bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. Yet under the previous leadership, there was a complete refusal to even allow a vote on the floor for this legislation. So really this comes down to leaders who are putting their own political interests aside and doing the tough work that's necessary to come together and pass the comprehensive immigration reform bill. That's what I look forward to working towards doing, and that's the kind of leadership that I'll bring together. It's a recognition that no one side is going to get everything that you want, but people's lives are at stake here on so many levels, and it requires action and leadership and those who are putting service above their own selfish interests. Thank you. Last with you.
Private for-profit prisons. Go.
Ban private for-profit prisons. We also need to ban those private for-profit detention camps. Having a business model that's set up around keeping people in these private for-profit prisons, I think goes against our very values, and it's something that we as taxpayers got to stand up against. Sorry, we're running out of time here. I know there's a lot more questions. I want to have a few minutes to be able to. Okay, Mark, sorry. We're in your house, so I got to let you get the last word.
So as a small business owner, I think that I'm paying more than my fair share of taxes, while I see other businesses that I feel don't.
Yes.
How can you make it so everyone pays their fair share?
Yeah.
Business
Yeah, this is
down to small business.
absolutely, absolutely. My family, I come from a family of small business owners. My parents are teachers by trade, entrepreneurs at heart, and so when I was 7, 8 years old, I was wiping tables in the family restaurant and sweeping floors, and just saw how hard they worked, but how rewarding it was for them to follow their passion in that way. This goes to the heart of everything that we're talking about. How it's possible that we have a tax code that makes it difficult for small businesses to be successful, paying more than your fair share, but you've got someone like Jeff Bezos and Amazon who is not paying any taxes at all and getting a tax credit, making record profits, paying no taxes and getting over $100 million in a tax credit. The system itself has to be turned on its head. This
We need a billionaire tax.
So it's overhauling the tax code and looking at all these different loopholes that are being exploited that have created this situation that make not only small business owners but everyday people having to, who are following the rules, who are playing by the book, and end up paying a high rate of taxes as a result. And those who know how to navigate the law and have actually built in those loopholes for themselves to exploit end up paying nothing. So there's two ways we've got to do this, is overhaul the tax code so it truly is fair across the board, so that we're actually empowering small business owners who employ 99% of people in this country. But then it's getting to the heart of how this influence is allowed to occur in the first place. We've got to get rid of these PAC contributions that lobbyists dole out to politicians in Washington, buying their influence. And we've got to stop the revolving door in Washington that allows those who are in positions of power to regulate these different government agencies to go from private sector to public sector, back to the private sector, to profit off of the laws that they just passed. And this is something that has to do with members of Congress. Members of Congress should not be allowed to go and get jobs as lobbyists when they leave office, to capitalize off the relationships that they have built. Senior staffers in Congress, senior staffers or senior military officers in the military who are writing government contracts to the tune of billions of dollars should not be allowed to then leave that job, turn around and go for the work for the contract they just wrote the contract for. Wall Street bankers should not be allowed to leave their bank, go and regulate through the SEC, and then go back and work for the bank that they just let off the hook. This is the legal corruption that's taking place right now that creates this unfair system that rewards the very rich and the most powerful, while the rest of us struggle just to get by. This gets to the heart of what we're talking about, the kind of leadership I'm talking about, that puts service above self, that doesn't play this game that's been played for too long, at the risk and the harm of most people in this country. I want to thank you all for joining me here today. I want to ask you to do one thing. I want to ask you to do one thing for me. We have qualified for the debates coming up at the end of this month. We're getting ready for them. It's a great opportunity to be able to get this message out there, but I need your help to make sure that our voice continues to be heard in the debates to come in September and October. We need to get at least 130,000 individual people to contribute to my campaign. At least $1. Whatever you can give, but at least $1. Right now we're nearing 98,000. So I need your help, yourself to contribute if you haven't already, and also to get at least five people who you know. I know you can get at least 5 people to part with $1. I believe in you. And really, here's my message to them, that even if they may not have decided who they want to support, who they want to cast their vote for, if they understand the importance of this message that I'm bringing to be heard across the national stage so that voters across this country can make an informed decision about who they want to serve as their next president and commander-in-chief, then please make that contribution at tulsi2020.com to ensure that this message continues to get out there. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for your support.